This presentation is going to be over an open source security tool called Brakeman. Before we get into how Brakeman works, it's important to understand what Brakeman is and what it's used for. So starting with what Brakeman is. Brakeman is a security scanner that analyzes a codebase for poor code practices that might open security vulnerabilities, as well as for imported libraries and other uses that are known to have security vulnerabilities. This tool is specifically designed to scan Ruby on Rails codebases. So the next thing we need to look at is what is Ruby on Rails? Ruby on Rails is a combination of a language and a framework. Ruby is a language with similar syntax to that of Python and other backend languages. Rails is a framework used for building APIs, thus producing the title Ruby on Rails, because the API is written with Ruby on the framework Rails. So now let's look at what components go into a Rails API. The main pieces that go into a Rails API for each database entity are the controller file, the model file, and the migration file. The migration file contains the instructions for building the entity table in the database. The controller file defines how information is processed for each HTTP request, such as get, post, put, delete, etc., those type of things, and controls what keys are permitted and required for a successful request. The model file defines different properties about the entity data, such as its relationship with other data types. So why is it important to look at these things? All of this we have looked at with Ruby on Rails impacts the security of APIs that are built with it. API security is extremely important because it relates directly to data security. The API is a connection point between the database and the user. The API is like a server in a restaurant who takes an order from a customer of what meal they want, goes back to the kitchen where all the food is at, and grabs the exact meal they ordered and brings it back to the customer. In this example, the customer is a client-side user, and the kitchen is like the database. If the API is not secure, the client has potential to manipulate it to fetch data from the database they should not be allowed to have. When we talk about storing sensitive data like social security numbers or payment information, or really any kind of personally identifiable information, providing this data to the wrong users can cause serious legal issues for the owner of the API, as well as loss for the owner of the data that's misdirected. So how does Brakeman help us secure our APIs? As we looked at before, Brakeman scans our Ruby on Rails codebase for vulnerabilities. This list shown here are some of the key things Brakeman looks for. First, we have known vulnerabilities. Known vulnerabilities are anything in the code that was acceptable for use at one time, but has since been discovered to have flaws. For example, use of the tag attribute protected, or ATTR underscore protected, was previously used in many Rails APIs, but has since been deprecated due to a vulnerability to be bypassed. The next thing listed here is user injection vulnerabilities. The example given here is where a user input is used as a parameter. When this is used in the execution without being checked, it's obviously dangerous as you have no control over what the user is providing. Brakeman also checks for denial of service vulnerabilities. In Rails, this means checking for instances where user input is converted to a symbol and is not restricted. If this is not restricted, a user could enter mass amounts of input, and since Ruby does not garbage collect symbols, the server could run out of memory. The next thing listed here is default routes. They are another vulnerability that Brakeman checks for in the code. It looks for a statement like the one listed here that uses the action command in routes. This would allow any public method on any controller to be called as an action. Another thing Brakeman checks for is potential SQL injection. We talked earlier about how Rails uses migrations. An active record migration file is created when you want to make a change to the database. You write what you want to do in Ruby, like is shown in the example here, and it writes the SQL statements to execute that task. When your Ruby code takes user parameters, it allows the opportunity for SQL statements to be maliciously manipulated by a user. Brakeman checks for instances where these statements are not implemented safely. These are just a list of the main vulnerabilities that Brakeman will search for, but not an exhaustive list. To see a complete list, you can visit Brakeman's website. So now that we know how Brakeman can help us, let's look at what Brakeman, or how we use Brakeman. Using Brakeman is really simple. The first step is just to navigate to your Rails project in command line. Before you run the scanner, you will need to install it. Installing it is simple, just running the command gem install Brakeman. Once we have installed it, we can run it with the command Brakeman and then the name of our Rails app. If you run just this, it will run the default scan configuration. But to customize what elements you want scanned and how you want the vulnerability report presented, you can use different options as listed over on the right-hand side here. Some examples of options you can run with the files is the A option that runs all of your files. Some of the other ones control how the output of the file is shown, such as the one below A there where it says O output HTML. This presents you an output report of your vulnerabilities as an HTML file, so you can open that in a browser. You can also output that as a JSON file. Those are the two main ones, but there's also other options for you. As you can see, you also have the option with compare and then give it an old report to look at the differences between a new report that you run and an old report to see what vulnerabilities you're improving on and how your project is getting more secure. There's also, of course, options to skip select files or run just select files. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of all the options that you can use, just some of the main ones. So now that we know how Brakeman can be used on our project, what are the reasons we should choose Brakeman? First of all, there is no configuration. It can run without any additional preparation. This is really nice because you can run it on multiple applications anytime you want without having to do a bunch of setup work first. It can also be run at any time. Many other scanners are designed to be run only when a new commitment is pushed to the repository. But this scanner doesn't work on that repository-based system, so you can run the scanner at will anytime you like. It also provides better coverage and more flexible testing than many alternatives. Additionally, it scans quickly and can be incorporated into Jenkins build files to provide that support for continuous integration testing. While Brakeman has a lot of positives, some things you may want to be cautious of is the potential for false positives. And if your project has an unusual configuration file, it might present inaccurate results. Brakeman only knows code, so it cannot predict external factors, and it is not omniscient, so its interaction between files is not always assessed accurately. Overall, Brakeman offers a lot of great features that can help with securing your APIs and ensuring that you do not cause yourself legal issues with leaking sensitive information, and also protect your users and their data from being leaked to malicious users.